Hey, it's Brett. This screencast is going to be on using VCR with Ruby tests. VCR is a gem that you can install that intercepts network requests in your specs and tests and records them as YAML files and replays them back when you run your tests so that every time you run your test suite, it's not making actual network requests to a live API because that API could have rate limiting. Also, that would slow down your tests considerably. So VCR is an option that exists to have nice, reliable specs that call out to APIs without actually calling out to them. I'm going to walk through setting it up and using it with RSpec. It's not too different to use with other testing frameworks. But the docs will definitely help you with that. There's this free API for the Studio Ghibli films, and we're just going to use it because it doesn't require authentication, and it's nice and simple, and it'll let us go through this whole process. There's an API that returns the list of Studio Ghibli films, and what we're going to do is we're going to test drive out fetching those films and returning them alphabetically based on the title of the film, along with the director of the film and the release date. So let's look at the code. Let me bump up the text size a little bit. Maybe one more. Okay, so here's what we got. Right now, what the code base that I have set up is quite simple in that we have a Sinatra application because I don't want to have to deal with setting a whole Rails application up and having all that code base for what's simply just going to be some request specs. But VCR would work with your capybara tests, your API request tests. You could even use it for unit tests if you needed, but I think we'll go through the process of like having an end-to-end test with VCR and then a unit test that doesn't require VCR. I think that'll be a nice balance between the two. So right now, there's an endpoint at the root URL that returns hello. There's a test that we run. This request helper is just using RSpec's default spec helper, plus it's using rack test, which lets us make that get request in our test, and it starts up the application and lets us assert on the responses. So this API is quite similar to RSpec's request specs, which is included in RSpec Rails. So I'm kind of faking it for the sake of this example. Now what we want to do is we want to start with just writing our tests. And instead of saying it returns hello, we'll say it returns the Studio Ghibli films with their director and release year in alphabetical order. You could imagine this is maybe being displayed on a web page or in an application. But for us, we're just going to work with HTTP data because it's simple. So instead of saying expect response body to equal hello, we're going to say something like we'll return just plain text for the sake of this example. So I forget what their films are in order, but we'll just start with Castle in the Sky. We'll say Hayao Miyazaki. Whoa, that's the wrong letter. We'll do 1986. And then we'll say new line, and we'll say this next one, Grave of the Fireflies, which I love that movie. The director is Isao Takahata, and that's 1988. And instead of saying to equal, we'll just say include. We'll just do like a partial test saying, okay, these are in alphabetical order through this test. So that's kind of nice. I think that's enough to get started. All right, so we have a failing test. hello is being returned, but castle in the sky and grave of the fireflies isn't. So let's go and call out to the API. We'll require net HTTP, which is the Ruby standard library for making HTTP requests. We can say net http.get, net http.get, and then you have your URI, which for us it's going to be is this URL. So we'll just copy it instead of typing it out. Let's just see what that does. All right, now we have a failing test. We're getting the response from that API as JSON, and it is not matching what we expected. Our data is not included. So let's go and work through that. We'll have response, and we'll take response.body. We'll do JSON.parse, response.body, and let's take that and see what we can do. So we'll have films. I now know what's wrong. Let's run the tests, see what fails. We're getting an error from the response, that's okay. Let's do films.map. We'll do something like film, F title, F director, F year. Films.join with a new line. Oh yeah, I've got these double quotes inside of a single quote. What's failing here? Forgot my closing bracket. All right, some things seem to be happening. Let's map them into the film array. Otherwise, it was like films wasn't changing, so we need to mutate film. Let's include release date. So every time I'm running this test, it is making an actual HTTP request to this API, but the data is not really changing, so that's not necessary. But let's look at the order and see what we got. So we got C, we got G. Let's make this test fail. Let's do house moving castle. So I think that would be correct. And also let's do this. What's the Ruby OF thing? I think it's that. Ruby UF long string. Forget the exact syntax. It is dash dash this string, and then terminate it with string. We'll do something like this, something like this, something like this. We'll run it and see it fail because it's not in the order that is expected, and we don't have Howl's Moving Castle's year, which is 2004. All right, we'll run that. It fails again, and what we need to do here is we'll do something like this: sort, join. Don't need to do map bang because we're just going to return it. Okay. All right, so the problem here is that we've got these films that are in this order, and I guess I don't know the alphabet. So let's improve our test by using actual data that's accurate. Run it again. Okay, that fails for some reason, which is surprising. I think it might be because we have these double lines. Let's run it again. Let's also do this. Get rid of the indentation. Okay, that passes. So, kind of weird stuff. I wonder if that dash is the problem? As a quick aside. Nah. Okay, anyways, we were passing. Okay, our test is green. That's what we want, which is great. Okay, that seems pretty decent to me. And now we can add VCR finally. Thanks for bearing with me to this point. Just wanted to show, like, okay, we got the HTTP request, now we're going to add VCR. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll add VCR and we'll configure it. And we'll add it to our gem file. You'll add it into your test group because you just want it in test and nothing else. We'll pessimistically pin it to 6.0, run bundle. We have this request helper that we're going to configure it in. And I'm just going to copy and paste. So we'll require VCR. Our cassette dir will make that spec cassettes. Hook into, I forget what that does precisely. I think that's what it uses to intercept the requests and capture it. And we'll configure RSpec metadata because we're using RSpec. All right, let's go back to our test and run it. Can't load Webmock. That's interesting. Let's see what it does. Whoops, typo. Okay, let's see what the docs say. This is an old version of the project. Okay, yep, so it's how it intercepts the requests, which is nice, in that I like Webmock, and I'm familiar with it. So that means we have to install Webmock, 3.13, bundle, run the test again. Oops. Okay. Hey, there we go. Yeah. All right. Whew. Thanks for bearing with me through that too. This gets us the error we want. This is the classic VCR error. Once you have VCR installed and it's intercepting requests with Webmock, it will raise an exception if it's making an HTTP request that it shouldn't expect. So if you're surprised, or not surprised, if you wanted to record it, use the VCR use cassette block. So we're going to do that. And yeah, we'll go with that. So then what you do here is you say VCR.use cassette. We'll call it, oh yeah, it's just the name. We'll just call it Ghibli Films. And then that's a block, and you can within it have the code run that calls to the HTTP API and passes. So that's cool. It no longer fails. Then let's look at our cassettes. Oh, I configured it wrong. Let's go to the request helper. I want to put these in spec cassettes. Let's delete it. We'll run it again. It's going to record a new fixture file. All right, so now let's look at spec cassettes Ghibli Films YAML. This is like the magic of VCR. It creates a YAML file with the request URL and has this string with all the data in it. That's the JSON, and it has everything about the status codes and all of that stuff. And now when we run the test, it's no longer making the HTTP request. It's using the VCR cassette. And that's pretty cool. And now you could run it on CI, or you can run it in environments that couldn't make that HTTP request, and you'll get the same thing that you want every time in your test. So they're deterministic, and you're not calling out to the HTTP API, and you're not potentially hitting rate limits, which is pretty cool. For RSpec, there's another syntax that's quite nice, which is you can say VCR and run it. And what that will do is organize your YAML files based upon all your RSpec metadata. So instead of it being that named Ghibli films that we had it before, now it goes to API requests, get, etc., based upon our RSpec metadata. And you may like that, or you may not. I think it's personal preference. I like how simple and clean this is. When you just name it, because this is such a small example. But if you had a large app with lots of tests, I could see it being quite useful to just use the metadata. And you can automatically include that metadata for request helpers, for request specs and RSpec and that sort of thing. So yeah, that covers using VCR. VCR has a lot of different options, like the way it records, which is cool. You can have it record them once, which I think is the default. So it replays previously recorded interactions, records new ones if there's no cassette, and cause an error to be raised for new requests if there is a cassette file. Oh, that makes sense. Once is the default. You can do new episodes, which records new interactions automatically instead of raising, and it will replay them. New episodes can be convenient. I'm not sure when you'd use none, so that would be something to experiment with. But generally, I think once will get you pretty far, and then new episodes might be quite useful if you're interacting with a lot of APIs. But other than that, that really covers a lot of it. Let's just browse the docs together and see what we find. Sometimes you might want to add tests for the sad path, like if it's down and returns an exception. And I'm trying to think of how you would do that. I guess you could set up the test data to fail in the way that you're expecting it to. Has options for filtering your credentials, which can be quite nice. Like if you have your password and stuff in there in the request URL, that's quite important to not have that in the YAML files, especially if it's like a public open source project. So this is useful for sure. But I guess you'd have to simulate the status. Let's Google really quick. Would be non-successful test. This could be a cool cool blog post. I'll link to this in it too. Yeah, I'll link to this. This seems like it's pretty useful. Cool blog post. Okay. That's basically VCR. But let's look at some with an end-to-end test that's like exercising the full stack and then we're preventing the HTTP request. Let's look at a unit test for this because I think that would be quite nice. So this does a bunch of stuff, which is all fine. But I think what I want is to have like a Ghibli film class that just like returns films. Like we'll say like Ghibli.films. Kind of funny, but that's fine. And then we'll join them that way. So let's create that in lib. Now we already have this code written, so it's not going to be the most, like we're not TDDing that for the unit test because we already wrote it. That's okay. We'll survive, but maybe we still want to have unit tests for it, which I think is quite nice. It was failing because of some of the code, but so this is passing still. So we have this integration test. This is using VCR, right? Because we set it up and configured it. Now let's test Ghibli. We'll describe the film's class method, and we'll say things like it returns an array of Ghibli films sorted by title. Yeah, it returns an array of Ghibli films with some info sorted by title. So we'll say something like expect Ghibli.film to equal, or we'll say something like to contain, we'll say to equal actually, because it's going to be an array. And we'll do, this is an array of string syntax. That's quite nice in Ruby, where we don't, well, let's just use normal syntax. Let's not get clever. And we'll just say, we'll just pick a couple of these. We'll pick these first three. Right? We'll do that. We'll run it, see what happens. Missing something here. Missing closing paren. So that is failing because it's trying to call net_HTTP in our Ghibli class, but that doesn't have net_HTTP. It's also trying to call JSON, so we'll require JSON. Run that again. All right, it fails because it's getting different data than we expected. And this again is making an HTTP request, but we have spec helper, not VCR. So instead what we're gonna say is we're gonna say expect net HTTP to receive get with we'll say something like kind of URI, because I don't know, I think that's the most important thing. And then we'll have it return a string of stringified JSON. So we'll say something like title. We'll take this data and do the best we can with it. So it's going to return a JSON. It's going to return an array of hashes that we're going to convert to JSON, which is a string, to a JSON string. So we'll have title, we'll have director, we'll have, at least this might be all unnecessary because we have that tests. We'll just do 2 of them and we'll put them not in order. Because we have that test and this is so simple, but there are times where, like, if we had logic in here, we do have some logic, we're calling some methods, but like if we had branching paths in here, this unit testing becomes important. Or like maybe we have an integration test that covers the happy path, but then we would unit test some of the like unfortunate behavior that we wouldn't want. So let's go and we'll do that. And this mocks it out and says it's going to return that. We'll call it to JSON. See why it failed. I forgot a comma for the array. And now we'll see that, oh yeah, because I changed the data. Okay, now that passes. So we're bypassing VCR, we're unit testing by mocking out the NetHTTP class, and that is like, cool, that's what we expect. Where I think this gets nice is if we want to add more tests for edge cases. But generally, I think this is a good place to start and shows the difference between unit tests and like an end-to-end test with VCR. Cool. I hope that helps. There's some asides and tangents in this episode and things not going right 100% of the time, but I think it's VCR can be a pretty useful tool. Maintaining the cassettes when you have a large code base can be difficult. So if you're only interacting with a couple APIs and it's pretty simple, there are other options like using Webmock directly. But VCR is nice in that you have confidence in it. But sometimes setting up the requests with the authentication and filtering out your credentials and maintaining the YAML files, especially if the API changes a lot, can be quite difficult. But on the other hand, if you're heavily relying upon another service like GitHub's API or something, it's likely you want to record those and have confidence, and because you don't want to be making requests on every run of your tests, especially on CI. And your CI service might not even allow that. But I think overall VCR is a pretty cool tool and quite nice. It's a good balance to like totally stubbing and faking things out in your unit tests, which requires like really fine knowledge of the API that gets returned. But what's nice here is like you can fake the data and just return what you need, because it doesn't matter if all this gets returned because we're not using it all, right? What matters is the data we're using in our unit tests. So, but if this was wrong, right? Like if we had title be name and we changed it here and we ran it, that unit test passes. But if we run our request spec, it fails because it's functions improperly. We could even make that raise an exception, right? We could have it be fetch, run it, unit test pass, run the request spec, and that fails because name is not a key that exists on the actual data from the API. So when you're setting up your unit tests, like your fake world in your unit test, that's really important to have that integration test to catch that kind of stuff. Let's run all of our specs. I'm gonna rename this to be spec request spec, because I think that is helpful. I just renamed it something I didn't want to. Golly. All right, let's run all our tests. They all pass. We only have 2 of them. Then let's run it in the browser and just see what that's like. I think it wants me to do this. Yeah, there we go. Let's make sure the tests still pass. Okay, they still pass. 4, 5, 6, 7. There we go. Not the most useful thing we've ever done, but it's code nonetheless. All right, thanks again. Take care and have a good one.